Nestled deep within the forests of Cornwall, Connecticut, lies a place known as the Village of the Damned. This ghost town is more than just abandoned ruins. Once a thriving settlement in the 1800s, Dudleytown is now a decaying relic, shrouded in eerie silence and surrounded by dense, foreboding woods. But what really happened here? And why do so many claim it's cursed? Let's uncover the dark secrets of one of America's most infamous haunted locations. Dudleytown was settled in the mid-1740s by Thomas Griffiths and later became home to the Dudley family, whose name the town carries. The Dudleys were reportedly descendants of Edmund Dudley, an English nobleman who was beheaded for treason in 1510. According to legend, the curse of the Dudley family began with Edmund's execution and followed his descendants to the New World. The tales of misfortune associated with the Dudley family have become central to the town's haunting reputation. By the early 1800s, Dudleytown was a small but thriving farming community. However, the area's rocky terrain and infertile soil made agriculture difficult, leading to economic decline. Over time, the settlement faced numerous tragedies, including mysterious deaths, disappearances, and instances of insanity, further fueling the idea of a curse. William Tanner, one of Dudleytown's early settlers, remains an enigmatic figure in the town's dark lore. His tragic demise has become a cornerstone of the haunted reputation that clings to Dudleytown. According to legend, Tanner began experiencing strange phenomena shortly after settling in the remote village. He claimed to have seen spectral figures lurking in the dense woods that encircled Dudleytown. These apparitions were described as shadowy, humanoid shapes that seemed to watch him silently. Tanner's neighbors, initially dismissive of his stories, began to avoid him as his behavior grew increasingly erratic. The spectral encounters reportedly grew more intense over time. Tanner described seeing ghostly forms standing at the edge of his property, flickering in and out of view like phantoms caught between worlds. He was plagued by disembodied voices, whispers, faint cries, and ominous laughter that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. These encounters left Tanner visibly shaken. As the apparitions became more frequent, Tanner's mental state began to unravel. He grew increasingly isolated, withdrawing from the small community and refusing to leave his home except when absolutely necessary. Tanner reportedly believed that the spectral figures were watching him at all times. He took to barricading his doors and windows, convinced that something sinister was trying to get in. Neighbors later recounted how Tanner would speak of these visions in a tone of desperate conviction. He claimed that the figures were harbingers of doom, sent to torment him for reasons he could not understand. Tanner's nights were filled with terror, as he was often heard screaming in his cabin, begging unseen forces to leave him in peace. In his last weeks, Tanner's paranoia reached a fever pitch. He abandoned his home entirely, retreating deep into the surrounding woods in a futile attempt to escape his tormentors. Villagers reported seeing him wandering aimlessly among the trees, muttering to himself and occasionally shouting at invisible entities. One morning, Tanner's lifeless body was discovered in the woods, but the expression on his face chilled those who found him. His features were frozen in an anguished grimace, as though he had died in the throes of absolute terror. Around his body, investigators found signs of a frantic struggle, scratches on nearby trees and disturbed earth, as if Tanner had been trying to escape something unseen in his final moments. Another chilling layer to the lore of Dudleytown is the story of the Carter family, which ties personal tragedy to the town's eerie reputation and has become one of the defining legends associated with the abandoned settlement. The Carter family, John Carter, his wife, and their children, settled in Dudleytown, lured by the promise of a new life in the remote Connecticut wilderness. Life in Dudleytown was harsh, with the town's isolated location and poor farmland presenting significant challenges to settlers. Despite the difficulties, the Carters initially seemed optimistic about their future. Their optimism was short-lived as tragedy struck the family shortly after their arrival. John Carter's wife, whose name has been lost to history, fell gravely ill. The exact nature of her illness remains unknown, but contemporary accounts suggest it was sudden and severe. Despite John's efforts to nurse her back to health, she passed away. Not long after, the remaining members of the Carter family reportedly vanished under mysterious circumstances. Some accounts claim that their children were playing near the edge of the woods and never returned. Searches were conducted by neighbors and nearby settlers, but no trace of the children was ever found. Theories abounded. but no explanation satisfied the grieving father. With his wife dead and his children gone, John Carter became increasingly withdrawn. Neighbors described him as a broken man, haunted by the losses he had endured. Then, one day, John himself disappeared without a trace. His home was left abandoned, his belongings untouched, and no one could determine where he had gone or what had happened to him. General Herman Swift was a Revolutionary War figure whose story is often linked to the legend of Dudleytown. He served under General George Washington during the war and was known for his loyalty and bravery. However, his later years were marked by tragedy. Herman Swift's wife is said to have been struck by lightning while standing on the front porch of their home in Dudleytown. This sudden and violent death devastated him, and he reportedly became reclusive and mentally unstable afterward. Following his wife's death, Swift is said to have descended into madness, isolating himself and living in grief until his death in 1812. This personal tragedy added to Dudleytown's reputation as a place of misfortune. Horace Greeley, a prominent journalist and politician, was married to Mary Cheney Greeley. The legend claims that Mary became deeply troubled and suffered from tuberculosis. It was during this time that Horace Greeley and his wife Mary came to Dudleytown, hoping for respite from the chaos of New York City. Horace sought solace in Dudleytown's isolation, seeing it as an ideal place for Mary to recover from her state. Mary, however, grew increasingly uneasy. She confided in her husband about shadowy figures she saw in the forests and a palpable sense of dread that hung in the air, but Horace dismissed her fears as imagination. Over time, Mary's condition worsened. She became reclusive, refusing to leave the cabin they had made their home. And they eventually returned to New York, but Greeley suffered significant setbacks, including losing his bid for the presidency in 1872 to Hiram Ulysses Grant. His wife, Mary Cheney Greeley, died shortly before the election, which deeply affected him. Following his defeat and his wife's death, Greeley's health deteriorated rapidly, and he passed away in November 1872. There are claims that the land around Dudleytown contains high levels of iron ore, which might disrupt compass readings and create the illusion of supernatural occurrences. Additionally, some suggest that natural toxins or radiation in the environment could have caused illnesses or hallucinations, fueling stories of the paranormal. Another possible explanation for the town's curse is witchcraft. Dudleytown was founded in the mid-1800s by members of the Dudley family who emigrated from England. To explore the potential connection to witchcraft, we must consider Connecticut's own dark history. Before the infamous Salem witch trials of 1692, Connecticut held its own witch trials during the 1600s. Between 1647 and 1697, at least 37 people were accused of witchcraft in Connecticut, with 11 executed. In Dudleytown, residents reported a series of eerie events: mysterious deaths, suicides, disappearances, and inexplicable illnesses. While skeptics attribute these tragedies to isolation and disease, some believe darker forces were at play, forces linked to witchcraft and the supernatural. Residents spoke of strange lights, eerie noises, and unexplainable animal deaths, events often attributed to witchcraft during colonial times. Dudleytown's remote location made it a breeding ground for rumors of the occult. Several residents reportedly succumbed to madness or disappeared without explanation. In Puritan belief systems, such tragedies were often tied to curses or witchcraft. While there is no concrete evidence that witchcraft caused the downfall of Dudleytown, the combination of historical events and folklore paints a compelling picture. Connecticut's witch trials reflect a society gripped by fear of the occult, leaving room to speculate whether Dudleytown's misfortunes were the work of witches, perpetuating its dark reputation. There's a far more sinister and chilling explanation, one that whispers of where the missing people vanished to and where the creeping madness began. Dudleytown was no stranger to hardship. Livestock died mysteriously, the soil refused to yield crops, and desperation hung heavy in the air. It's said that in their despair, some townsfolk may have turned to something unspeakable, something forbidden, the curse of the Wendigo. As we've explored in a previous video, the Wendigo isn't just a monstrous figure of folklore. It's an evil spirit that preys on those who commit the ultimate transgression, possessing them, twisting their minds, and plunging them into insanity. Madness spreads like a plague, and soon the creature forms, bringing even more despair. In Dudleytown, people didn't just disappear. They vanished without a trace, leaving behind shattered families who succumbed to madness before disappearing into the woods themselves. What supports this explanation is the story of John Brophy, whose tragic tale aligns with these unsettling patterns. The story of John Brophy and Dudleytown is another haunting tale intertwined with the cursed history of the abandoned settlement. His tragic tale stands out as one of the most chilling accounts from this eerie locale, as Brophy is often referred to as the last person to live in Dudleytown. John Brophy was an Irish immigrant who moved to Dudleytown in the 19th century with hopes of starting a new life. The small, remote settlement seemed like a place where he could find peace and build a future. However, his time in Dudleytown was marked by a series of devastating events that fueled the belief in the so-called Dudley Curse. Shortly after arriving in Dudleytown, tragedy struck. Brophy's wife died unexpectedly. The exact cause of her death remains unknown, but it plunged him into deep grief. Not long after his wife's passing, Brophy's 2 children also died under mysterious circumstances. Some accounts suggest they succumbed to illness, while others claim their deaths were unexplained. This left Brophy entirely alone, overwhelmed by sorrow. In his despair, Brophy began telling neighbors that evil forces were at work in Dudleytown. He claimed that dark spirits had taken his wife and children, warning others that the land was cursed. His behavior grew increasingly erratic, and he became consumed by paranoia. One day, John Brophy himself vanished without a trace. Some legends suggest that he wandered into the dense forest surrounding Dudleytown and was never seen again. Others claim that he may have fallen victim to the malevolent forces he believed were haunting the area. His disappearance remains one of the many unsolved mysteries tied to Dudleytown. Today, Dudleytown is off limits to visitors, as it is privately owned by the Dark Entry Forest Association. This private, non-profit organization manages and protects the land surrounding the abandoned settlement of Dudleytown in Cornwall, Connecticut. The organization is dedicated to the preservation of the natural environment, specifically the Dark Entry Forest and its surrounding area, which includes Dudleytown. Dr. William Clark, a leading cancer expert at the time, purchased property there in 1900. His house became a holiday home for himself and his wife. One summer in 1918, they were on vacation when Clark had to leave for New York on business for 36 hours. Upon returning, he found his wife in a state of complete distress and insanity, claiming that strange creatures were in the woods. Shortly after, she committed suicide. Clark remarried and stayed in the area until his death in 1943. He helped to found the Dark Entry Forest Association, which has worked to preserve the surrounding forest and the site to this day. So, what do you think? Was it an organization created to prevent people from catching a curse, or was it meant to protect the land in the area? And would you ever consider visiting this town if it were open to the public? Let me know in the comments below, and feel free to suggest ideas for upcoming videos.